Hi, I'm Ebony C. Peace.
And I'm Joshua Lewis Berg.
We are both students at Meadville Lombard Unitarian Universalist Theological School. And the following podcast was recorded as the final project for our class called Spirituality and Social Justice Activism in African American Traditions, taught by Dr. Pamela Lightsey. Our assignment was to create a podcast that discusses a current human rights crisis for Black people in America. We choose the right to democracy. Our fifth Unitarian Universalist principle calls for, and I quote, the right of conscience and the right of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, end quote. So, to begin, we will lay out our operational definition of what we mean by democracy. Democracy is a system of power in which the citizens are supposed to have power. President Lincoln's famous remarks that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth, end quote, was a call to consecrate a promise that to this day remains unfulfilled. According to Johns Hopkins University professor Martha S. Jones, quoted in the Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s book, The Black Church, Lincoln is of the view that slavery may end, slavery will end, but people of color, people of African descent will never be full citizens. Since democracy's claim is that the power resides with the people, if people are disenfranchised to the point that they're not able to exercise their power or authority as full citizens, they cannot express their right to democracy. The human rights crisis for Black people of the right to democracy stems from a systematic, and often violent dehumanization of Black people in America that rob them of fair representation and self-determination. We know there are numerous democratic processes, and we cannot address them all in this podcast. So we will focus on three, which include the right to vote, the right to safety and security with regards to policing, and finally, the right to protest. We will also include the role of spirituality, religion, and religious practice and social justice activism relating to these processes, as well as the right to democracy in general.
Thank you so much, Ebony, for laying that out for us. And I will begin with the first process, the first right, human right that you spoke of, which is the right to vote. And to begin, I want to say what is so overall infuriating. There are many infuriating things, but one of the most is that the very impetus for founding of this nation was to establish taxation with representation, in contrast to the British rule, which was taxation without representation. And yet, people of color have been and still are taxed in so many ways and then subsequently disenfranchised without representation. Carol Anderson, in her book, One Person, No Vote, quotes the Alabama civil rights attorney Hank Sanders talking about this very idea of democracy when he praised or he lauded the 1965 Voting Rights Act that set in place a requirement at the federal level so the government would approve any voting law change. And this was to prevent these restrictive voting laws. And this was the first time he said Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act can complete something this country started 200 years ago. And that something is not complete. It is called democracy. So he was saying that until 1965, we never even began to instill true democracy for everybody. And even then, as you'll see, it was problematic. So Anderson also frames this as not just a democratic right, the right to vote, but she calls it a, quote, talisman of humanity, something that actually imparts humanity. So the denial of that right was yet another way Black people were dehumanized. And it's very clearly the right to vote, both a denial of the right to democracy, as we can see, as well as a human rights issue. So how is this right to vote denied? Well, historically, as we know, it was very direct and very violent, and still often is. Henry Louis Gates Jr. writes in his book, as you mentioned, The Black Church, quote, as Jim Crow laws took hold, African Americans lived under the constant threat of violence and lynching, while state and local laws stripped away their voting rights and forced them to live on their side of the color line, end quote. And Carol Anderson quotes Carter Glass, who was a Virginia representative, and he was responding to a question about implementing this Mississippi plan. This was in 1890, implementing it in Virginia. It was a plan which masqueraded as legal protection against voter fraud, but it was incredibly, as many of these voting right restrictive laws are, it was very discriminatory, the Mississippi plan. And Carter Glass was asked, if you implement this in Virginia, would it be discriminatory? Would it be fraud? And he responded, fraud? No. Discrimination? Yes. Discrimination, he said. Why? That is precisely what we propose, to discriminate to the very extremity permissible under the federal Constitution with a view to the elimination of every Negro voter who can be gotten rid of legally, and I put that in quotes, without materially impairing the numerical strengths of the white electorate. So it's been said over and over again by the very people who are implementing these laws, the reason they're doing it is to discriminate and disenfranchise. Voting rights restrictions included, I'll list some of them, but we're not limited to, beatings at the polls, targeting Black voters for assassination, literacy and comprehension tests. And when they did these tests at the same time, they were, for instance, underfunding Black schools. William Jones talks about how there are two levels of this discrimination. You underfund the schools, and then you implement a comprehension or a literacy tests. There were poll taxes, which the government would actually purchase the poll tax for white people, but make a greater poll tax and not purchase it for Black people. There were white primaries. They required IDs, yet they closed the places where you could get the ID anywhere near the vicinity of Black neighborhoods. They reduced voting locations in Black neighborhoods, and they still do, which requires Black people to find the time and resources to travel sometimes many, many miles just to get the ID, just to cast the vote. Carol Anderson talked about long lines in her book, One Person, No Vote Too. And I'll just read briefly. It says, the conditions, she writes, that bring about 5-hour wait times, or thousands standing in line, or only 40 people able to get through and cast their ballots after 3 hours, are concentrated overwhelmingly in minority precincts. In short, this is a burden that is disproportionately borne in order to exercise that fundamental right to vote, she writes. In 2012, on average, Blacks had to wait in line twice as long as whites. In the 10 Florida precincts with the longest delays, almost 70% of voters were Latino or Black. Nationwide, in the 2012 election, she writes, whites who lived in white neighborhoods had the shortest wait times of all citizens, just 7 minutes. It's just very clear that the disenfranchisement. And of course, the constant detractor from voting was the threat of jail. As we know, Black bodies are disproportionately targeted and incarcerated in the prison industrial complex. In 1979, Julia Wilder and Maggie Bozeman were convicted of fraud and given 4 to 5 year sentences when what they were doing was legally collecting absentee ballots. So the threat of jail is very real. Just want to take 30 seconds here to talk about something many people, especially those claiming to follow the Constitution to the letter, they know little about. And it's the language of the second part of the 14th Amendment in the Constitution. And that's the amendment and the language used to justify denying felons the right to vote. And all it says in the broadest terms in that amendment is that, quote, rebellion or other crime disqualifies a citizen from voting. That's all it says. And if you're a student of history, you'll know that these words were directed specifically at acts of treason against the nation, nothing more. None of the crimes people are arrested for now that disenfranchise them. It's not in the Constitution. Yet courts have interpreted the life out of these words. And now they encompass any crime, any felony, and they routinely disenfranchise not only incarcerated people, but those who have also already served their time. It is completely against the intent of the Constitution, but directly in line with the intent of white power to disenfranchise Black people. A strict constitutionalist actually would deny for treason the January 6th insurrectionists the right to vote according to the Constitution. Yet that is not happening. John Lewis, in his autobiography, Walking with the Wind, writes about how in the 1960s, quote, another terrorist tactic was to print the names of all the voter applicants in local newspapers. And the publishers fully cooperated with this, which made the new Black voters visible targets for everything from getting fired from their jobs, having loans denied, seeing their rents increase, being evicted, all of this, besides, of course, that ever-present danger of violence. So as our country supposedly becomes more progressive, conservatives have had to find more loopholes and tricks to undermine the right to vote for Black people today. It's not as open, it's not as direct as it was in the day when Black people were beaten, when governors were buying poll taxes for white people and directly stating this is what they were doing. Now they sort of have to hide their intentions. But even just this past decade, Chris Kobach, who was the former Secretary of State of Kansas, used these databases, as he calls them, exact match and cross-check, which supposedly were checks against this non-existent voter fraud, which is always the bogeyman. And they had a huge error rates. Literally, they were only used to delete thousands of legal voters from the polls. Carol Anderson wrote in her book about a 2016 voter legislation that was rejected by Judge Dina Gribben because, quote, all North Carolina's claims about the dangers of voter fraud cannot and do not conceal the state's true motivation. The law not only has a discriminatory impact, it has a discriminatory intent. It boggles my mind how people can buy into this lie of voter fraud when the laws are obviously discriminatory, even up to the Supreme Court. If they just read the history and look at the history, they would see what is really happening. Just this month, the Supreme Court upheld restrictive voting legislation in Alabama. Legislation written by the American Legislative Exchange Council, an extreme right-wing group, once again under the guise of protecting against voter fraud, but quite obviously meant to disenfranchise. And the Supreme Court, the right-leaning court, bought Alec's argument, even though no evidence of widespread voter fraud has ever been proven or shown. And the minuscule amount of evidence, mostly faulty evidence, that might point to non-impactful fraud would not have even been corrected by this legislation. I'll just close with that idea. I'm going to read quickly page 65, talking about this fabricated proof of voter fraud. Carol Anderson writes, the bogeyman of voter fraud has also proven useful in North Carolina, where Republican Governor Pat McCrory insisted that the only way to keep the monster at bay was the draconian ID law that the state instituted. A systematic analysis by the North Carolina State Board of Elections of nearly 4.8 million votes in the 2016 election found only one vote that could have possibly been stopped by a voter ID. The story was the same across the United States. Law professor Justin Levitt conducted an extensive study and uncovered that from 2000 to 2014, there were 31 voter impersonation cases out of 1 billion votes nationwide. But the law of voter fraud remains. It's a political weapon. So from the time of beatings and lynchings to today, when it's these voter fraud and disenfranchisement, this denial of the human right to vote is still going strong in our country, just more insidiously and in different guise.
Yeah, Joshua, I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, you went through just a list of major things. These are not just small, little trivial. I mean, these are major problems that continue historically, as you've shown. Voting is a civic duty. It shows that we care about our lives and the lives of others. Voting changes things. Voting is power. And that is why, as you were sharing, there is just so much pushback against this for Black people, for minorities, for anyone who doesn't benefit from white supremacy culture. There's just this concerted effort to deliberately, it's so blatant now. It's like, really? How much more blatant? They're not even pretending not to be racist anymore. They don't have to. And the thing that really hurts my heart is that a lot of what they're doing to discriminate and to be so blatant is legal. They are legally able to disenfranchise people. You talked about the Constitution denying felons the right to vote and just misinterpreting it like crazy. But you know what? You and I know that it's not the first time something sacred has been misinterpreted for the purpose of white supremacy culture and racism. And it's sad. But at least we're becoming more aware of these things now. And I think this gets us right into our next topic of, let's think a little bit about this Juneteenth holiday versus police reform. Now, what do they have in common, Juneteenth and police reform? Well, I want to just switch gears and talk about the symbolism of Biden voting in or saying that now we have this federal holiday, Juneteenth, and it's a token gesture versus what we really need, which is deep change. The bottom line is that creating a law to support the right to democracy does not result in the demonstration of the right to democracy. For example, people of color and allies protested for months in support of police reform. Instead of police reform, the federal government gave us Juneteenth. Really? And Juneteenth, I'm glad we have it. But you know what? We did not protest for months and months for Juneteenth. If I had a choice, Juneteenth or police reform. When was the last time, Joshua, when was the last time someone's life was taken because we didn't have a Juneteenth? So making Juneteenth a federal holiday is symbolic, token gesture. Our government saying, we will officially celebrate the emancipation of the enslaved of the United States, but we will still allow our police officers to brutalize, murder, and abuse their power without accountability. Police officers who their historical purpose was to recapture kidnapped, enslaved people. Once slavery was, so-called outlawed, their purpose was then to arrest Black people for violating these trivial laws that were just designed to legally enslave and brutalize them again. We were not protesting for months for Juneteenth. We were protesting for the inherent worth and dignity of every person, for police reform, for the dismantling of white supremacy culture, to defund, rebuild from scratch what it means to serve and protect. We are seeing the same things, same programs, just renamed and reinvigorated, in a negative way. History, it's just repeating itself. When you were talking about disenfranchisement, a lot of what they're doing then, they're doing it now. Why? Because it works. And in Georgia and in other states, we fought so much against it. People came out and voted, and that scared them because it worked. And so now they're coming back and saying, oh, we got to say voter fraud because people exercise their vote, and we can't let that happen. We will always need the support of white allies and benefactors. I believe that historically, people of color have not gone too far without the help of white allies. Who put in money to start the schools? Who did that? Who taught the first enslaved person to read? It was a white ally. So we need them, and we want to continue to connect and be and just appreciate each other for what our allies bring to the table and how they can support us. But you know what? Not just white moderates who are not racist. We don't just need not racist white moderates. We need anti-racists. In a letter from Birmingham jail, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he wrote, and I quote, "The white moderate lives by a mythical concept of time, one that for Black people translates into deferments and frustrations," end quote. We need allies who will not just give us food and water along our journey, but who will walk with us, be with us in the moment, connect with us as global citizens, as siblings in humanity. And I feel it, you feel it, that progress is too slow. It's too slow. And James Baldwin said it best in 1989, as quoted by Charles Emblow in The Devil You Know, the Black Power Manifesto. He quotes James Baldwin as saying, "You always told me that it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress?" That's what he says. And this concept of time is so deeply felt. This is why the Black church continues to be meaningful for so many. We need a place to rest our head, lay down our worries, mourn and celebrate with others in a sacred space. This sacred space is so needed for Black well-being, which is why it has and continues to be such a target for those seeking to hurt Black progress.
Absolutely. So many people are talking about defunding the police. It's not a matter of just defunding the police. It's a matter of funding opportunities and resources, because the crime is caused in white and Black neighborhoods because of lack of opportunity, resources, and education and healthcare and all these things. That's where the funding needs to go. And then there won't be a need for the police as, a police state, which I don't believe there is a need for anyway.
Amen.
Amen.
That's right. Exactly.
And speaking of the police state, I'll get into the next process in human rights issue for Black people, which is, we were going to talk about petitioning, a different treatment of protesters, Black protesters. So the First Amendment, as we know, protects our right to assemble, and it protects our right to express our views through peaceful protests. And certainly during the slaveocracy, first few hundred years of this nation and beyond, Black people were not considered, as you said, full citizens or even full humans, lynched, murdered, beaten for much, much less than protest. So we're not talking about the ability to protest at the beginning of the country, because there wasn't even an ability to do anything without risk without their lives being threatened. So when this right was contested and brought to trial, the right to protest, and I'm moving into the more recent generations, juries, even as Black people began to protest, juries were still made up most exclusively of white citizens. And another human right is the right of a jury of your peers, which was denied to Black people routinely. And they were routinely convicted when they were trying to protest, not by a jury of their peers, but by a jury of racist white people. So again, this is another level that denies the right to protest. Jumping even to today, you talk about how Black people are still denied the same rights to protest as white people. All we have to do is look at the treatment of right-wing protests versus police reaction to Black Lives Matter protests. Just look at the difference. Black Lives Matter protests, law enforcement agency organizations were pre-staged. They were standing there in military, like uniforms before the protest even start, to counter what was overwhelmingly a nonviolent protest. And they used violent means to counter it, tear gas and beatings, pre-staged. They were there beforehand, assuming that these Black people and people of color and their allies were going to be violent. Yet on January 6th, there was no such assumption. Not only there was no other agency than the Capitol Police, you didn't have military police staged there, you didn't have anyone pre-staged there. No other agency was even called to that protest until it was too late, and the Capitol Police were overwhelmed. It was such a difference in how the government treats the different protesters. No tear gas. Majority of violence was against the Capitol Police on January 6th. Not the police keeping the protesters in check, but letting them run wild. Whereas the Black Lives Matter protests, it was the police keeping the protesters in check. The barricades at January 6th were so flimsy, the protesters just broke through them. Whereas if it were Black people breaking into the Capitol of the United States, you would have heard shots. They would have rung out immediately. Black people would have been killed. I mean, it's not speculation, it's just fact. Chris Rock, the comedian, says Black people are born a criminal. There was one of his specials called Born a Criminal. And that really rings true, because with this dehumanizing image, with this idea that Black people are criminals at birth, that the white majority and the white supremacy culture has, responses to Black protesters are just not in line with the threat that is presented. Even the optics are obvious, where you have peaceful Black people being beaten back versus a right-wing protest where you have police stepping aside so that these people wearing camouflage and carrying machine guns can just walk right through. And yet an innocent Black person who's not even armed, who is not committing any crime, is beaten and killed. And a person with a machine gun can walk through, and the police step out of the way. It's already talked about Black bodies stolen in the prison industrial complex earlier at a much greater rate than any other group as well. So that threat of jail is there as well, which it is not to white people. It's a method of denying the right to people protests, as the threat hangs over every Black protester, this threat of imprisonment and violence. And finally, I'll just say that the right is denied because, as we've seen, right-wing extremism and racism is also tied to the police and the military themselves. It's inextricably tied. It's woven into the police and the military, this right-wing white supremacy culture. And I'll just leave it at that as far as the right to protest.
Yeah, Joshua, it just makes me sick to my stomach the way they literally stepped aside and just let them walk through. Talk about an insider job. In the Capitol Police, I recall, they asked for backup. They're like, hey, I think something's going down. No one is saying anything, but we kind of think something's going down. Can we get some help? And it was no. And it's just ridiculous. It's so sad. And when you were talking about Black bodies being stolen in the prison industrial complex, we have these two justice systems. We see it play out all the time. Two people can be found guilty of the same crime and be reprimanded very differently. I saw a cartoon, on Facebook or Twitter or something like that, and it had a spectrum of color from white, light brown, dark brown to Black. And on the white end, the little caption read mentally ill. And on the Black end, it read terrorists. And the police is looking at the color-coded and holding it up to the person, trying to see, are they mentally ill or are they a terrorist? The lighter they are, more mentally ill. The darker, more likely to be a terrorist. But that's the truth. It's a cartoon, but these cartoons, it's just showing what our reality is. So based on the evidence so far, it's clear that racism, double standards, and inside help from some politicians who supported the insurrectionists played a large role in what occurred and how it was perceived. I saw some other cartoons. They had some of the politicians, some of the Republicans, cowering in fear. And then the next little scene showed them talking, on the floor about, these were just tourists coming in. Well, why are you cowering in fear, but yet you're calling them tourists? They were just hanging out and you're buddy. No, come on. Now that we have videos and pictures, there's so much that you just have to shed a light on now. You can't hide it. And so that's why it makes it so blatant, because you can see the lies. You see the video. And it just lets us know that there's just so much more work to do right now.
You like you said, you can't hide it. And yet Republicans, right-wing extremists, white supremacists are running scared because they're being confronted with the truth now through video. You can't just simply say no and tell a lie. They're trying to stop critical race theory from being taught. They're trying to not be accountable for the history of our country because it will, make them look really, really, really bad. But we need to be accountable in order to move on. There's no other way to go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And, so taking that, let's consider what role, if any, religious practices play here. Because, this class we're taking, it's about how all this connects to spirituality and advocacy. And so if we look at this in the context of religious practice, should there be activism relating to the right to democracy? Should the people do something? And you and I know if the answer is anything but yes, our country will continue to crumble. Our country will continue to have these inside jobs of this mess that we saw that happened on the Capitol. So if we, look at the other countries around us, the others who deny their citizens the right to democracy, we can see with our own eyes what it can mean for us in the United States. Our people are already doing something. As we speak, battles for democracy are taking place in many states, especially Texas and Georgia. These battles are part of just a larger war. And just a few days ago, members of the Democratic Texas legislature, they left the state. They left the state literally to block a part to block this restrictive election law that was about to be voted in. And not long before that, the same group of Democrats, they assembled at a predominantly Black church after protesting the restrictive proposal. And to me, that just makes clear how the Black church is still a sanctuary place, a place to regroup and work together to fight oppression that targets people of color. This Texas legislator, Democrats, they're outnumbered here, but they know what the right thing is. They see through this blatant racism, and they're like, you know what? If we have to leave the state to not have this pass, we will do that because this is just wrong. And just because something is legal doesn't make it right. And we see this play out. And if things can just get aligned, what's right and legal can just get aligned, that will be awesome, but that's what we're trying to do. But again, this history is just repeating itself, and the struggle is real. It's really real. And consider this, when the politicians felt, at their wits' end, these Texas legislator Democrats, when they just felt like, are we really going to have to leave the state? Like, what else can we do to stop this? We know how wrong it is. We know how racist it is. We know how hateful this law is. Where did they go? They went to the Black church. They went to the Black church leaders for spiritual leadership to sustain and empower them. Just as when Reverend Jesse Jackson ran for president first time in 1984, in the book, The Black Church, he says, the logic is the same, that the Black church is prominent, the Black minister is a major symbol of leadership, and that this prominent symbol of leadership would then move into secular politics. So there's that connection. We see a lot of spiritual leaders moving into politics, and we see politicians coming to spiritual leaders to fulfill their call when they're at that cusp of what is moral and what should I do when they're confronted with something that's so wrong and hateful.
Absolutely, absolutely. What we've read about the support the Black church has given all along from this time of slaveocracy until now, it really was the place where a person of color, Black person could maybe sense even a modicum of freedom in a world that denied them their humanity. I mean, Du Bois talked about the Black church's worship as the preacher, the music, and the frenzy. And I often find it interesting, frenzy, F-R-E, and freedom starts with F-R-E. Not that they're etymologically the same, but that frenzy seems to me the only time where you could even get a sense of freedom. And it expanded in the Black church, to the point where this was a feeling of home. This was a feeling of community. This was a feeling of support. So naturally, that extension went into politics, as human rights are being denied. The Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, when he learned that North Carolina passed their voter suppression laws, made cuts to healthcare, 2016, he quotes, and this is again from Gates's The Black Church book, quote, "As clergy, we came together. We said, we don't need a left critique or a right critique or conservative or liberal. We need a moral critique. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk in the legislature with the Bible in one hand and the Constitution in the other." I mean, this is the church bringing in morality and ethics. And it's not just about, necessarily law. It's about spirituality. It's not necessarily about reason. It's about, morality and ethics. Praying, congregating together in spiritual practice of community support for democracy. It's just not new, but it continues to be needed now as it has been since the time of enslavement. It's still needed. People of color, Black people, against all of these odds, all of these dehumanizing processes we've talked about, fight back courageously. They do it through legal means, like Stacey Abrams is doing now in Georgia, but they also do it with the assistance of the Black church. In Georgia, for instance, Stacey Abrams, her Fair Fight Action organization is a great example. More Black people, especially church leaders, have been and still are running for office. And Black churches help facilitate voting efforts with giving space and finances and logistical assistance. And talking about the grassroots get out the vote effort in 2017 special election. In her book, Carol Anderson, she was talking about the race between Doug Jones and Roy Moore in Alabama. She wrote that, quote, meanwhile, Righteous Vote, which was an voter rights organization, whose emphasis was on turning out Black churches, has 120 captains representing 146 churches just across Alabama. And that effort alone from the Black church reached an estimated 300,000 people. So there's a fight back, and it's supported by the Black church and the spiritual support that the Black church gives. As far as the Black church, it's been an aid, and sometimes also, it's been a hindrance, is what we've read, to the cause of Black protest. Certainly leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis, who were pastors themselves, took full advantage of the influence of the Black church to further the cause of human rights. But on the flip side, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, who's a Georgetown sociology professor, quotes in Gates's book, The Black Church, again, he talks about how in the late 19th and early 20th century, the independent Black churches separated into these factions, and some wanted to gain favor in white America and some didn't. And he quote, those internal machinations of class division and warfare were there from the beginning. The respectability politics was born in a good way when Black people were trying to adjust to the new situation for us to win and curry favor morally. I'm quoting him again, but the irony is we're trying to convince white people to see us as human. No one should have to convince anyone else to see them as human, especially the people who enslaved them in the first place. And white people, he says, they don't see Black people as human. Dressing nicely can't do it. Speaking the king's English to the queen's taste is not going to flip a switch, is what Dr. Michael Dyson was talking about, relating to the Black church in the 20th century, who were trying to appease white people in order to get ahead. That's just not the way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about with the Black church and how that helped to get the vote out. Those who don't want Black people to vote, they know that. They know that the church is just an integral part of getting out the Black vote. They know it. And that's why I believe in some of the restrictive voting laws that are getting pushed out there. They want to say, oh, you can't vote on Sundays. Why? Because the Black church on Sundays, if voting is allowed, they will be there. They will go on their buses and their carpools, and they will show up. They will get their people there. And those who don't want Black people and other people of color to vote, they don't want polls open on Sundays. And also, people of color, they've got jobs. They can't just take off work. They usually tend to work, not usually, but they often have jobs that are less flexible. And so it's hard to take off of work. And then you have to stand in line for 5 hours because they don't put enough polls out. I mean, it's really hard to come out to vote. So Sunday voting, weekend voting is really helpful for people of color and poor people who don't have job flexibility, who, if they have a babysitter to watch their child, the babysitter's only available on the weekends because they're working too. So it's just so blatant, these reasons. You can't give someone water when they're waiting in line for 5 hours. It's not because of what you say. It's because you want the person to get dehydrated and go home or to pass out, and so they can't vote. I mean, it's just ridiculous. The thing is, though, too, I think that not all churches, though, have been a haven or a support to Black people. James Baldwin, who accused Christianity of reinforcing the system of American slavery by just palliating the pangs of oppression and delaying salvation until a promised afterlife. But he also praised religion for inspiring some Black people to defy oppression. He wrote, "If the concept of God has any use, it is to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God can't do that, it's time to get rid of him." That's what he said. And as far as religion in general, Martin Luther King Jr. was disillusioned with the white liberal church in general. In his letter from Birmingham jail, that was quoted in John Lewis's book, which he wrote in 1963, but it still rings true today. He wrote, and I quote, "I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers." Now, this is Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. speaking. He says, First, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. So these words just really resonate with me.
Yeah, me too. And as ministers in training, as a white minister in training in a mostly white denomination right now, we need to heed these words. Yeah. Take action, live in discomfort, in accountability, and not just accept it. Fight back actively alongside our kindred human beings, risk our own comfort and even our own lives, because the fight is just simply too important. We will never be a truly equitable nation if we're not accountable and don't, really get into the fight and not mince words and not try and avoid conflict. At the same time, it doesn't mean justice can't come along with compassion. It doesn't mean that there isn't love involved, but part of love is loving every single person.
Well, that's a lot that we just went through. And this class has just been eye-opening. Really, and I know, as a Black person, it's like, wow, I see these things, I feel these things, I hear them, my peers and my family experience them, but why? Why is it this way? And so these books that we referenced and the quotes, that we spoke of have just been eye-opening to me about why, and that it just continues to repeat itself. And, what can we do? So go ahead and close this out, Joshua.
One of the things you can do is interact face to face, eye to eye with other people, read people of color, listen to podcasts, listen to their words, sit back, shut up and listen. I'm being extreme here, but I'm serious. As a white person, I growing up, I could name 100 different white people that we read, maybe 2 people of color. I could read a person of color for the rest of my life and not read as many people of color as I've read white people. So inform yourselves and talk to people, interact with people, build relationships, and that's part of religion as well as relationship building. But the desire for self-determination, Dr. Pinn calls it desire for complex subjectivity, I believe, desire for human right of democracy, which we're talking about, it's universal. Yet there's disproportionate attack against these rights for Black people. And to address it, we must do it together. Some of the places I recommend going, I've worked with Color of Change, which is colorofchange.org. We knocked on doors in Detroit when I was there and registered people to vote. Fair Fight Action, as I mentioned before, fairfight.com, which is Stacey Abrams' organization. Give some money if you're in Atlanta, volunteer.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, because we're watching this play out on TV, and a lot of people are thinking about this issue. Like, we can't help but think about it. It's all over the news, but there's much fewer people actually doing anything about it. Yeah. So I love those recommendations for those who want to get out and do something. I also would recommend the Poor People's Campaign. They have, in different states, you can get in and do stuff and even do it through virtual, participation and things. So the Poor People's Campaign is another reference to go out if you want to make some change. If any of this stuff we talked about bothers you, go to the Color of Change, as Joshua said, the Fair Fight Action, and the Poor People's Campaign, which is poorpeoplescampaign.org.
Awesome. Well, as you said, this is a lot. So we had probably talked for another hour about this, but I would like to conclude with a poem by Langston Hughes. And this was also from James Cone James Cone's book, which we read, called Black Theology and Black Power. Langston Hughes writes, quote, "I swear to the Lord, I still can't see why democracy means everybody but me."
Mm. Yeah. And he wrote that a long time ago, and here we are, 2021.
Yeah.
You've written it this morning.
Yep. Astounding.
All right, Joshua. Well, thanks for doing this podcast with me, and I think we made a great team here.
Yes, thank you so much, Ebony, as well. I couldn't have asked for a better teammate. So thank you.
All right.
And, we'll see you in class tomorrow.
See you then.
All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.